Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Mara. I'm the Director of 5 Million Questions here at the University of Dundee. Delighted to welcome all of you here to the University this evening. We're just shy of 8,000 people now who have come through these doors for 5 Million Question events over the last 20 months. And we think that's quite an unprecedented level of engagement around these issues, or frankly, for almost any issue for universities in Scotland. So thank you to all of you, first of all, for your support for this programme ongoing, and the many positive comments we've had from patrons of 5 Million Questions. So I want to quickly draw attention to the postcards that are in front of you, which advertise a new top masters programme here at the University of Dundee on devolution and global governance. Filling up quick, get your applications in, but it builds on much of the work that we've done here through the 5 Million Questions programme, drawing on the experts we've engaged with and the insights we've developed. So if you're very interested in the issues at hand tonight, then you'll find a lot more about them in that programme. So that programme has discussed identity, economics, welfare, defence, Europe, a fair bit, the currency, an awful lot, theatre, literature and music. But it feels to me that we're now reaching a crescendo in our programme. Over the last couple of weeks, we have been delighted to welcome the leader of the No campaign, Alistair Darling, and obviously tonight I'm delighted to welcome the First Minister, Alex Salmond, here to the University of Dundee. And if you can imagine this is a crescendo for us, then imagine how it feels for our principal guest tonight, as this is something of a crescendo for a lifelong project in terms of his aspiration for independence for our country. Alex Salmond was first elected as leader of the SNP some 24 years ago, and in that quarter century he's been a real key figure in Scottish politics, and particularly since 2007, a key figure in UK politics as the SNP were elected to government at Holyrood. In that short time, well, the last 7 years, and now becoming the longest serving First Minister in that young office's history, he has redefined the role of First Minister and has created, I would call, a new form of Scottish politics that will itself reach a crescendo on the 18th of September. So chairing tonight's public conversation will be David Torrance. He's the Associate Director of our programme here at Dundee, and I'd ask you to welcome him, but principally our guest, Alex Salmond, First Minister of Scotland.
Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us for what I'm sure will be a very interesting evening. The format is the same as previous events, half an hour of questions from me and then half an hour from the audience. First Minister, can I kick off with the most recent opinion polls? We've had innumerable opinion polls. STV yesterday, with undecided stripped out, we have 60% against independence and 40% for. Obviously, we're in the official period now, 4 months to go. Do you think you can still do it? It's quite a lead the No campaign still has.
Do I think we can still do it? Yes.
How will you close that gap?
Well, as I know you're about to say, David, that Murray poll, of course, had the gap closing, albeit, as you rightly say, still to a 20% gap. Murray's, it's quite interesting. I mean, you should take one opinion poll, obviously, with a pinch of salt, although, like any politician, the amount of salt depends on what the poll is saying, you know, if it's a good poll. But over the piece, let's put it that way, there's been a distinct movement towards yes across the opinion polls basically since the white paper launched last November. Now we'll have to accelerate the pace of that, but to a certain extent that happens as you move towards either election or in this case a referendum day. The pace does accelerate as people focus their minds and concentrate on the day of decision. That always happens. And therefore, in order to the issue is not whether you can close the gap. The issue is to win the argument, win the debate, because that's what allows the gap to be closed, and people will come to a judgment. I think it's undoubtedly the case that there are many fervent supporters of yes and fervent supporters of no, but a lot of folk are still not necessarily undecided in the sense that if you said, how are you going to vote tomorrow, they wouldn't know. But if you say, how are you going to vote on 18th September, then certainly they're interested in the arguments. And my view is that if you win the arguments, then you win the elections.
Okay, let's fast forward to, not to the 18th of September, but the 17th of September. I was going to ask you...
The 17th, that's good.
What
I mean, most people ask you about the 19th.
Yeah.
So what are you going to be doing the day after? The day before is a lot easier, David. I'll be rushing in the country. I'll be going to every major city, including the celestial city of Dundee. I'll be having large meetings. I'll be straining every sinew to get the yes vote out.
well, let's imagine you have some downtime towards the end of the 17th.
I don't think that's likely, David.
Okay, let's imagine. At that point, you don't know what the result's going to be, or you might have a good idea what the result is. At that point, say after 24 years on and off as leader of the SNP, 7 years as First Minister, at that point, in a reflective mood, what do you think your legacy would be?
Well, I think that will be determined on the 18th of September.
Focusing on your time as First Minister.
I can absolutely tell you, David, that on the 17th of September, I shall be fully occupied in seeing if we can win this referendum for Scotland. I was asked last week at the Scottish Council Development Industry AGM what I would be doing the week after the referendum. And that was a lot easier, because I mean, I'll be watching the golf in Gleneagles. I don't know what anybody else will be doing. I'll definitely be doing that. But the day before the referendum, then it's then you're in the finishing straight. That's a pretty easy one. Honestly, I don't spend a great deal of reflection and time in considering legacy issues, David. I really do think this is the best way forward for Scotland. The reflection I have on this is a wonderful thing that we're going through this now. I mean, it's not unique. There are other examples in world politics. But a democratic decision on nationhood and a fully inclusive, peaceful, consented process, which is incidentally not just a tribute to the Scottish Parliament, but to the Westminster one as well. This is a consented process. This is an extraordinary thing. Tricia Marwick the other day, and we have so many signature points just now. It was the start of the official campaign period the other day. And Tricia Marwick, the presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament, did an interview, and she said, this is an exemplar for the world. And she's absolutely right. This process by which we are going through is an international exemplar. This is an extraordinary, wonderful thing. It's not, as people say, the greatest decision for 300 years. This is the first democratic decision in Scotland's history. There wasn't a democratic decision 300 years ago. So this is no mean thing, and I can't focus all my attention and see if we, as I say, we can win this referendum.
But laying aside the referendum, I appreciate that's difficult to do. Are you content with your term as First Minister, your 7 years as First Minister? Do you feel you've advanced Scotland economically and socially in that period?
I'm probably not the most unbiased observer of my term as First Minister of Scotland. I mean, there's one or two things. If you ask me, name a single thing that you're proud of, then I would say the restoration of free higher education to the people of Scotland. I think that was a good thing to do. If you want some more dry economic stuff, then we've had exceptionally difficult times with the austerity programme over the last few years. It wasn't a given that Scotland would sustain its economy better than the UK as a whole, but we have done. That doesn't mean there's not lots of folk have suffered greatly, because clearly they have. But we have lower unemployment, we have higher employment, we've got higher labour force participation, we've got a very sharp rise in women's participation in the labour market in Scotland, which is a great thing. So there are good things in terms of the economy, but as I say, if I had to put my finger on one thing, I think free education is an extraordinary thing, very much in line with Scottish tradition, but very much a signpost for the future.
Do you still, on higher education, do you still have concerns about access from students from poorer backgrounds? I mean, this has been well documented that, of course, free tuition in itself has not necessarily boosted the numbers in that respect, and not least at your own university, St Andrews.
Well, since I'm in Dundee University, you're absolutely right about St Andrews. I think St Andrews University, we concede that it's got some distance to travel, and of course Mr Russell is engaged in a process with the universities, many of whom have responded extremely well in order to get the question of access. And you're quite right to put your finger on it. The access is improving, David. But in terms of what you do, apart from persuading universities or having a conversation, which is responded to, I think, in large part. What do you do? I mean, well, I'd have thought you'd point to the educational maintenance allowance, scrapped by the coalition government in 2010, but maintained in Scotland. The educational maintenance allowance is the grant that goes to children from poorer families to stay in education, either school, college, or university. This is an important thing. Obviously, and the figures will tell you, not just in St Andrews, David, but in a number of our universities, we would like to see far more people from deprived backgrounds taking advantage of this thing. But I'll tell you what, not having free education, the people who would have the greatest barrier to access an education are people from poorer backgrounds. The people who are most frightened of accumulating tens of thousands of pounds of debt will be children from poorer backgrounds. And we don't need a crystal ball to identify that. We can just look at the book as to what's happened south of the border since the imposition of the 9,000 tuition fee.
I mean, this touches on an important aspect of the referendum campaign, inequality. I mean, I think undoubtedly the referendum has raised the profile of inequality as an issue, both within Scotland and within the UK. But in terms of tackling inequality, what could an independent Scotland do? And bearing in mind that when it comes to income tax, you've said that will stay in line with the UK, others will be cut, like corporation tax, VAT in specific instances, and air passenger duty. Will that not make it harder in fiscal terms to tackle inequality rather than easier? Well,
can we just talk a wee bit about what's happened in Scotland, again, during tough times? The Rowntree Glasgow University study of last month showed that for the first time ever, the rates of poverty in Scotland are less than the UK average. Now, that doesn't mean, incidentally, that is in international terms anything to shout about. Compared to many of the Northern European nations, it's still absolutely deplorable. But that's the first time there's been a crossover. Why has there been a crossover according to the study? Well, basically, housing costs as a major example of policy in Scotland collectively by the Scottish Government and by local authorities, which have decreased the pressure on poorer families relative to what's happening elsewhere. But the best way to take this example is to take child poverty. Let's take child poverty. From 2007 to now, child poverty in Scotland, relative child poverty, has gone from 21% to 15% of families in Scotland. That's the number of families with children identified as in relative poverty. Now that, you may say 15% is still an awful lot of children, and it is. But 21 to 15% through recession is no mean achievement, and that's lower than the UK figure now. But the benefit changes. By any estimation, they're going to take that figure back up again. Now, there's an argument about how far. Some people argue, like the IFS, it's 50,000 more children back into relative poverty. Some people, like the children's charities, say it's 100,000. But that figure's going to go back up again. And either most or all of the gains that have been made in the devolution period are going to be lost if the benefit changes come through. So I would say, David, that controlling benefits, social securities, not bearing down on poor families with children would be an important area of policy which the Scottish Government would pursue a different point. And the same would apply to people with disabilities, the same would apply to carers in society, and the recent announcement yesterday by Nicola Sturgeon and the paper that's being produced tomorrow. So there is no doubt that there are some things which we have done which have assisted in tempering conditions of poverty in Scotland. There's equally no doubt that the course and direction that the UK government are on is going to substantially increase poverty in Scotland. And therefore, in my view, one of the great arguments for independence is having control over these levers of policy to enable us to produce a more equal and a more just society.
But at the same time, most of the levers will be moving downwards. I mean, you've not committed to radically increase welfare payments, for example. As I say, you've committed to several tax cuts. Do you not accept that certain fiscal levers, such as income tax, for example, can be used to address inequality much more directly?
Well, there's an interesting publication at the weekend, which was from the Jimmy Reid Foundation, which was the Common Wheel. And I was listening to Robert McAlpine in the radio, and he made a very interesting, important point in terms of the Common Wheel was a project which looks at the radical changes that could be enabled in society, some of which I support and some of which I don't support. But one of the important points he made is, look, you've got a country of 5.25 million people with lots of resources. Then the areas that you should be looking for change on to produce a more equal society are the resource aspects of the economy. For example, control of the Crown Estate by local communities would be a good example of the areas and direction of policy that it's talking about. There is a limitation to what you can do in terms of income taxation.
And
but
you don't support, for example, the Common Wheel wants to raise taxation.
No, the point I was making, there are some policies which I think are doable and pursuable in Scotland for the benefit of all, and there are some things which aren't. But, or for example, last week, the policies that we identified in order to create growth and additional tax revenue in Scotland didn't involve individual changes in taxation, but involve changes in economic performance and changes in work availability to bring about a more prosperous and more equal society. But do I have any doubt, David, that a Scottish society will be more equal as well as more prosperous? None whatsoever. Do I think that is one of the key arguments for an independent Scotland, to allow our political choices? You kindly talked about the length of my political career. The 25 years or whatever it was. One of the big differences in that long political career over this last period is that for most of that political career, I and the rest of Scotland were engaged in campaigns which were about trying to stop things happening. You're trying to stop the poll tax or the closure of Ravenscraig. They were reactive campaigns to things that were being pronounced from Westminster. And in that political career in the last few years, in some things, I've had the ability, my colleagues have had the ability, the Scottish Parliament's had the ability, Scotland's had the ability since the onset of the Parliament, in some areas of policy, to actually strike out in our own direction, to actually make things happen, as opposed to campaigning to stop things happening. Now, if that has worked, and I think it has, in the areas of policy which we control, like education and access to it, and free education and its importance, if it's worked in areas of health, like maintaining a national health service for all the people, free at the point of need, actually reintroducing that. If it's worked in these areas of policy, and that has been the chosen direction of the Parliament, then why wouldn't that be the chosen direction of the Parliament and the government on the areas of policy that we don't control, like social security or taxation policy? That will be the direction that an independent Scotland establishes.
But on income tax, you have supported increases in the past. The first Scottish Parliament campaign, you had the Penny for Scotland policy on the basic rate, a power the Scottish Parliament's had for a long time. In the late 1980s, you opposed Tory tax cuts from Nigel Lawson's budget. What's changed in that respect? Because you are now quite conservative with a small c, perhaps, on income tax in particular. Has there been an ideological shift?
David, I'll never be as conservative as you, or a bigger or a small c. Well, on top rate tax, for example, which was, as you rightly say, David's going back. David, as you know, some of you might know, David's my biographer, right? This guy knows more about me than I do. And often when I read his stuff, I think, I didn't know that. but he knows these things. And in 1980, I intervened in the middle of Nigel Lawson's budget speech to make a point about the direction of reduction in top rate taxation. If I was in the House of Commons over the last few years, I'd have voted against the reduction in top rate taxation by the Tory government. Indeed, my colleagues, of course, forced a vote on it 2 budgets ago and weren't supported by others, but nonetheless forced a vote on it. If we're doing it now, right now, then I would say that while you're in the process of austerity, that the top rate of tax should not be dropped, because it totally destroys the argument that people should be jointly together trying to move the economy out of recession. So you're quite right to say that people's views do change over time over what's possible and what's not possible. But that ain't one of them which has changed. In terms of being
on the penny for Scotland?
I was going to come to that because I thought you were about to get there. I suppose what has changed in that is two things. One, in the period of office that we've had, I don't think, given the pressure on family budgets that we've experienced, that it would have been sensible or reasonable to look for an increase in that bit of direct taxation that we control. There's also another argument about this, that in sense of the taxation changes that we wish to make, let's take air passenger duty, for example. So why do you want to reduce air passenger duty? Is it to allow people to go on cheaper holidays? Well, I suppose that's quite an attractive idea, both in and out. But actually, air passenger duty is about increasing direct connections into Scotland. And it's about the arguments, which are pretty substantial, that if you increase direct connections into Scotland, then you increase the economic gain and you increase the taxation take because of people paying other taxes when they get here, like VAT and all the rest of it. Unless you control the other taxes, you don't have that instrument available to you. So if I was able to lower a tax, like air passenger duty or corporation tax, and by doing so increase revenue, increase jobs, increase employment, then of course I would do that. You don't tax for the sake of being punitive. You tax for the sake of producing a greater economic result, just as you intervene socially to try and produce a more equal society.
One more question on that. Thomas Piketty, the French economist, is of course
I knew who he was.
An unlikely bestseller. His book Capital in the 21st Century. He does have some specific policy proposals: an 80% upper rate of tax, a global wealth tax, specifically targeting unearned income, land, housing, shares, whatever. Would you back both those ideas to reduce inequality?
I think I'd probably have to look at them in a bit more detail before I gave you an answer.
In principle?
In principle, I mean, in principle, for example, been attracted to the idea of the Tobin tax, as long as you can get everybody into it. Because if you had a global transaction tax on financial transactions, which had no detriment in terms of financial centres, then that is a very attractive idea. Why? Because for a very, very small rate of taxation, you could raise a very large amount of money. The difficulty is, of course, in getting agreement. But in principle, I think that's a good idea. Other things that I think will transform society, the whole childcare debate. I had a great friend, the late Professor Ailsa Mackay. Incidentally, one of the people who was on the Welfare Commission, which is reporting tomorrow. And it took me years to realise the wisdom of Ailsa's arguments as far as childcare were concerned and the economic return from childcare and what that did to society, not just to child development, which I'd appreciated already, but in terms of the rebalancing and the articulation. No, we've had a fascinating debate in Scotland about the availability of skills in the labour force. And yet, what Ailsa managed to convince me of is there's lots and lots of skills which are effectively locked out the labour force through lack of affordable childcare. And why wasn't it an immediate priority to try and unlock these skills and what the economic benefits would be? And as she gradually convinced me over the years, I've now seized that baton and I realised she was absolutely right. Not just as a tribute to Ailsa, who was a remarkable person, but also because her arguments were correct. She did a presentation beginning of last year in Aberdeen to the Council of Economic Advisors. Now, the Council, they're not designed to be intimidating people, but there's 2 Nobel laureates on the Council of Economic Advisors in economics. Therefore, I don't know, if people think of, who are here, whatever you do, think of making a presentation to the most expert person in your field, right? So for an economist to make a presentation to 2 Nobel laureates in economics is no mean thing. And Ailsa made a presentation on the childcare proposals and on the economics of it, in which she did extraordinarily well. What I didn't know, and nobody knew, is when she made that presentation, she was suffering from terminal cancer, and she knew it. And I mean, I was amazed at the eloquence and brilliance of her presentation anyway. But when I reflect on just the context in which she made it, now that argument about transforming childcare and with it transforming women's ability to get in the workforce, I think is one of the most powerful articulations of how we should emulate what other societies in Northern Europe have already done. And it's one of the things where the integration and the necessity, why is it part of the independence debate? Well, people say, why don't you just expand childcare this time? Why don't you just move to school hours childcare for 2-year-olds upwards right now? You can do that, you can introduce that. Well, the argument is, and the articulation is, of course, as you expand the ability of women to work in the workforce, then you generate revenue as a result of that work. Not just income tax, but national insurance, employers' national insurance, VAT, council tax, every tax. And unless you've got access to that revenue, which if you raised by 6% female participation in the workforce, £700 million. Unless you've got access to that revenue, that is what makes the policy sustainable in economic terms.
Your figures on that have been roundly attacked.
No, it's the other bit of the figures, David. That bit of the figures hasn't been attacked. What's been attacked is the connection between offering childcare and getting 6% more women participating in the workforce. That bit's been attacked. There's no serious argument.
Do you accept the criticism on that point?
Well, no, I don't. But nonetheless, the argument about what you would generate if that happened, see, I actually think it's pretty logical. I think it's logical if there is access to childcare of that level, then a lot more women would come into the workforce. I think that's a logical thing.
As many as you predict?
Well, yes, because
IFS and others have cast doubt on whether there are enough.
Yes, and my old friend Donald Mackay did exactly the opposite. Professor Donald Mackay, an economist not known for his left-leaning inclinations, went to the Scottish Parliament Committee and pointed out that it is automatic. If you offer childcare, then you attract into the workforce. And it's not a once and for all, 1 year, one cohort thing. It's something that accumulates year after year as people are not shut out the workforce. And it's not just I don't think we've even scratched the surface on the gains that are made. Because the gains that are made are not just about child development, women's access, are not just about generating more revenue to make the policy affordable. The gains that are made are not interrupting people's career. They're skill gains. They're company gains. The companies don't get the disruption of losing for the length of period valued members of staff. There are fantastic gains to be made. If we just finish the point about the £700 million. Currently, the way things are, £600 million of that tax benefit goes straight to George Osborne. I know George Osborne. Believe me, if we get 6% more women in the workforce in Scotland and generate £700 million of additional revenue, the last thing that George Osborne would think about was returning that £600 million to Scotland to make the policy sustainable. He would have all sorts of other things, but that is the very last thing that would be first in George Osborne's list of priorities.
Is that not an argument, though, against the Scottish Government doing anything that promotes economic growth at the moment because you don't see the proceeds from that?
No, it's an argument for how you make policy initiatives sustainable. Let's call it the childcare test.
But that's your reason for not doing the childcare policy at the moment?
No, the reason for not doing it, David, is I would have to deduct £600 million from universities or health or one of the other hard-pressed budgets. The argument is to make policy initiatives such as that more affordable. Now, not every policy initiative that I would like to make has such a substantial and coherent economic return. Some policy initiatives you've got to do because they are the right thing to do. But if you want to make something affordable, then the choice of a policy initiative that has such a substantial impact in the economy is a fantastic example of why you need that rounded version of powers and why people who say, listen, we would just do it anyway under devolution have got the serious questions to answer.
Okay, one more question from me. Looking ahead to an independent Scotland, I know you'll like this question.
This is better than the day before.
This is the day after, or several days after. Now, you've spoken often quite eloquently about the potential benefits of independence, but assuming that a brand new state will have challenges, problems, as well as opportunities, what are some of those problems? What do you foresee in terms of difficulties and challenges of a newly independent Scotland?
Right. I think we've got some substantial challenges in terms of economics, in terms of productivity. We've got to get our productivity in Scotland up to the top performers in Europe, up to the top quartile. That's a challenge for us economically. I think we can do it, but it's a challenge. We've got a demographic challenge in common with many Western European societies. We have an issue about demography that we're going to have to meet because our population on balance is becoming older. And therefore, we're going to have to face the issue about demography, about having more people, working age people in Scotland. It's quite interesting. I set out last week an agreement actually as to what target you would need or what figure you would need in order to maintain a better dependency ratio, as it's called, like we have at the present moment, or equal to the forecast for the UK. And that is about 24,000 net migrants a year. It was reported in the Herald newspaper as Salmond sets target for 24,000 immigrants. Now, I was quite interested in this because it's not an immigration figure, it's a net migrancy figure. That, in other words, the difference between people going out and people coming in. The average since the Scottish Parliament, the average over the last 10 years has been 22,000. So actually, the additions we need, which is either less people going out, and Scotland every year, incidentally, loses 30,000 people between the ages of 18 and 35, 30,000 people, or alternatively more people coming in. And incidentally, the people who come in are by a huge, substantial majority people from the rest of the UK who are valuable, like everybody who comes to work and live and be part of the Scottish community is valuable. But the irony I thought was interesting, and I spoke to the Herald editor about it, it was that the journalist who wrote the story and the editor of the newspaper are both part of that 24,000 net migrancy figure. And I was quite interested as to whether they regarded themselves as immigrants, as the headline indicated. So one of our challenges in Scotland is to understand and realise that our problem over the last 100 years has not been immigration, but emigration. That our challenge as a society is to take on the argument that somehow people choosing to live and work and be part of your community is some sort of threat, as opposed to what it actually is, which is an enormous compliment. And our argument and our challenge as a society to understand that universities like this one and our other universities, part of their lifeblood are the students who come from overseas. And as we train and educate these people over 4 years and more, if they wish to stay in our community and contribute some of their skills by working, then we should allow them to do so, as opposed to trying to chase them out the country, which is what happens at the present moment. So our challenge as a society is to take on this agenda, which categorises people as if they're somehow less valuable because they are, quote, immigrants, and recognise that we as a community need that balance of working age to the population, which will allow us to go forward together as a country. That's our challenge, David.
You pointed out in the Herald piece that, of course, England's population has risen by a much greater proportion than Scotland's. Do you have an overall figure in mind? I mean, would you be comfortable with 6 million people in Scotland, say, 10 years after independence?
It's quite interesting. I mean, a number of people in the No campaign, surprising people, Labour Party people, have been saying, my good, if you have 24,000 net migrants a year, that is like having another Edinburgh in 20 years' time, as if this is somehow a problem, that we should think of it as a problem. If you actually took the UK figure, and took the UK figure, incidentally, not for inward migration in the UK, but for migration from out of the UK, and not the standard figure, the accepted figure, the figure accepted by the Tory party, as 165,000. If you use the same language, that's 3 Birminghams in 20 years. It's another example of, I think the 24,000 figure is what we put forward. That's our net migrancy target, as opposed to the 22,000 we've achieved since devolution, and I think it's a very sustainable target.
So it's another Aberdeen in 10 years, say, 250,000.
If you wish to put it that way, David, it's another addition, a valuable addition to the Scottish population. You also referred to Scottish population. Between 1901 and 2001, 100 years, right? Scottish population increased by just over 10%. Population of England increased by 60%. 60% over the same period. Now, there were some particular aspects to that. I mean, the First World War, for example, was even more damaging to the communities in Scotland than it was to communities in England and elsewhere. I mean, apart from, I think, Russia, probably in terms of the damage to particular Highland, North East communities, but right around Scotland. So there were particular aspects, but that wasn't the real reason. The reason is relative economic failure. That's the reason for the 10% against the 60%. It is, in my view, incidentally, the single most effective condemnation of economic management from London over the 20th century is the difference between these two figures. Since this Parliament was established in 1999, I think the establishment of Parliament has been a significant part of this. That trend has been put into reverse. Rather than having a declining population, which is what we had from about 1970 to 2000, we've had an expanding population. I think that is a sign of success, and I think we should continue that success by setting our mind to attract more people to live and work in our country. And I also think we should provide economic opportunity so that people don't have to leave our country. Incidentally, I've nothing against folk leaving if, because the modern world, the 21st century, that's one of the great joys that people can travel to work and skills and all the rest of it. I've nothing against that. I don't think people should have to leave because they can't get economic opportunity in their own country, and it should be available if that is what they want to do. And between these initiatives which I specified, can we get that 22,000 figure at 24,000 and answer that big question? Yes, we can.
Okay. Time now for questions, and I'm sure there'll be lots. Who to pick first? Gentleman in the black there. Just wait for the microphone if that's all right. It's coming down.
Thanks very much, Alex. Thanks for the vision. Going back to the original question, which you asked earlier, which is the gap in the polls, or the gap that we've got currently at the moment. What's the winning strategy with 3 to 4 months to go? Just about like Gordon Strachan. What do you have to do to get the players on the park and make it happen? What do you see happening in the next 3 to 4 months, and how do we get a yes vote?
Well, Gordon was asked, I call him Gordon, you see, you're First Minister, you get to call Gordon Strachan Gordon. He was asked that very question last week before the Nigeria game, and his answer was, well, if we scored more goals than they scored. And as it happened, it was 2-2. So if we get more votes, then they get more votes. I think I spent a lot of time in that entire length of political career that David has written about so meticulously. I spent a lot of time losing elections. I never actually lost a personal one, thank goodness, but losing national elections, I've lost more national elections than hot dinners I've had, and it took me a long time to work out why I was losing. And the answer is quite simple. When I came into politics, parliamentary politics, like in 1988, there were the 3 SNP members in a parliament of 650 people. And if you wanted to be not ignored, which is the final thing for any politician or political party, to be ignored, that's it, that's the death sentence. If you didn't want to be ignored, then you've got to put your point across forcibly, and you've got to jump up and down a bit and make sure you were heard, come what may. And that's fine and great, and in opposition, that's the right and entitlement of any opposition to do. But if you actually want to win something, win an election to govern, or win a referendum to try and create a new perspective for this country, then you've got to do something more than jump up and down. You've got to have a positive vision of the future. And it's something I realised in 2007 that I've tried to stick to ever since. I mean, there's going to be argy-bargy in any politics, but essentially, it's the positive case. At the end of the day, particularly when people are looking at something as important as this, people are absolutely desperate to do the right thing. People make great mistakes thinking that, by and large, people vote in individual interest or specific boxes. Is it going to be good? I'm a farmer. Is it going to be good for me? Or I'm an industrial worker. Is it going to be good for me? People actually vote on what they believe is the right thing to do. And the vast majority of people want to see and do the right thing for themselves, their family, but also for the wider community in their country. And therefore, a campaign, in my estimation, which stays on a positive track, which articulates a positive vision, which doesn't allow itself to get deflected by all the noise and hurly-burly, but it presents that vision in an active and vigorous way, is the campaign that will win. I think a positive campaign will be a negative campaign in any election. Negative campaigns can win. They win when the campaign against them is negative. And in that case, the most negative campaign wins. If a negative campaign comes up against a positive campaign, the positive campaign will win because people want to do the right thing. They want to vote for something, not against something. And that is no great secret. That is our ingredient of success over the next 100 days.
Okay. Chap in the white shirt, just over there.
I say this against the background of the European elections. Was compulsory voting ever considered for the referendum? And is following the Australian system something that you personally appeals to you?
I don't think it will happen incidentally, but it's one of my wee heresies. I actually like the idea of compulsory voting. I think there's a lot to be said for it. Now, I do get right. People would be quite entitled to go along compulsorily into the polling station or by post and write, they're all a bunch of idiots, you know, or whatever. They're right, I wouldn't vote for any of these clowns. They're perfectly entitled to do
None
that.
of the above, yeah.
To spoil their paper or to do whatever. And I'm sure they do in Australia. I mean, actually, there are people here do that, even though it's not compulsory. There was an example of, I read it in, well, I was going to say I read it in the paper, it must be right. I read it in the paper and it might be right. About apparently in the Western Isles, that someone put above everybody's name, all the lists in the European elections, clowns, 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 good people, clowns, clowns, clowns. And the vote was accepted on the basis that the returning officer decided that she had shown a clear preference. So I think there's a great case for compulsory voting. I have to say, in the referendum, I don't think it's going to be necessary. I think we're heading for an 80% turnout in this referendum, as opposed to the European elections, where I think it might have been useful to be. I think this question of civic duty and civic responsibility. I don't suspect I'll ever get a majority for this.
Can you actually argue for?
Well, I'm arguing for it right now, but I don't think I've raised the issue a couple of times with colleagues, and I didn't get very far. So I don't think it'll ever be introduced because it's, I suppose, against the sort of accepted political culture. But I have to say, I don't think the Australians are wrong in this. There's also the questions of implementation and fines and all the rest of it. And I suppose that makes it perhaps impractical. But there are things I think we can do. The 16 to 18-year-old voting. People have argued it in terms of the rights and wrongs of it. In terms of, as I would argue, if people are old enough to pay taxes if they're working, then they're old enough to vote. Taxation representation strikes me as important. And yes, of course, you'll get 16-year-olds who don't know much about the political process. There are 60-year-olds who don't know much about the political process. There are 16-year-olds who know a great deal about it. There are 60-year-olds who know a great deal about it. So I think on that argument, I think the 16 to 18-year-old voting has it. But there's another thing about it, which I think is very important. A long time ago, when I was a young MP at the Two Works in Fraserburgh, a shop steward took me aside and said, see these young guys, the apprentices you're going to speak to? He says, none of them, hardly any of them will be voting. And he says, and they'll say it's because, it's politicians, what does it matter, it makes no difference to me, etc., etc. He says, that's a bit of bravado. He says, a lot of these guys won't vote because they've never been shown how to vote. And, we all may think that's pretty ridiculous. Most of us here are probably quite interested in politics. It's not ridiculous. And as he explained it to me, going into a polling station, an authority thing, the first time I went to a polling station, my dad took me and showed me what to do. Now, a lot of youngsters are not in that position. Maybe their parents don't vote. Maybe that's not available to them, that instruction. And he told me that years and years ago, and I think he's right. And one of the things I think is great beneficial about 16 to 18-year-olds voting is the school aspect to the voting process, getting the arguments. I think there's an argument for going even further than that. I think it's a grand idea that many people are having their first vote at school. I think that'll help people into the democratic process. And so I think there's other things to be done, as well as our shared belief in compulsory voting, and probably more practical things to be done. But I don't think we're going to have a problem with participation in this referendum. I think we're heading for 80%, and I think that's a good thing.
Just as an aside, you weren't actually able to vote in the 1979 devolution referendum.
That's
right?
correct. That's correct.
Why was that?
Well, because there's a few of us here, will be old enough to remember this. It was held on the 1st of March, and because it had been the winter of discontent and the strikes, etc., they didn't have a marked up register. So I had a postal vote at St Andrews University, which I'd had for the previous year. And there was no way of finding out that postal vote was still current because there was no register. There was no register of postal votes. There was no, and they would send a postal vote to my student residence in St Andrews. So when I arrived dutifully at the polling station in Linlithgow to vote, I was told you're marked down as a postal voter. So I had the choice of trying to get to St Andrews to find my postal vote, and given it was lunchtime by then, the chances of doing that were few and far between. Raking through the 23 Albany Park to find out what they'd done with my postal vote to try and find it, or just to accept the situation that I was being foiled. And I'll tell you what added insult to injury was, if you remember, not only didn't they have a register of votes, and you couldn't find out if you had a postal vote, they were also under the 40% rule, counting non-voters as no voters, effectively. One of Ewing's favourite phrase was, that was fantastic. He said, Britannia used to rule the waves, now it waves the rules.
That's a good line.
So it's something I have in common. Well, no, I was not in common. I was going to say in common with Joanne Lamont. She was a no voter. She actually voted. I was ended up as a no voter by default because they'd fiddled the postal vote system.
Lady just over this side here. Just wait for the microphone.
Hi, I'm a few steps forward and looking towards the 19th of September and a yes vote. My question to you is, what sort of skill mix would you like to have on your iScotland working party to ensure the negotiations work out the best for Scotland?
Right, it's a great question. I think two things we've got to do. One is it has to be cross-party in terms of the Parliament. And I know, and I've made it clear, look, folk on the other side just now, they're not going to say, oh yes, I'll be part of the negotiating team. It rather prejudices their position. So I'm not asking them to do so. I'm just making it clear that the offer will be there. So it'll be a Team Scotland approach across the political parties. And not just people in the Yes campaign like ourselves and the Greens, but also the parties who are part of the No campaign.
Led by you, though?
Well, I'm First Minister, yes, led by me. No, I'll tell you, I thought, see that Alistair Darling, maybe we should get him to do it, But on a cross-party Team Scotland basis. But there's another aspect which is equally important, and that is both civic society in Scotland and also expertise, which is not necessarily within Scotland, although much it is, but beyond Scotland as well. So I think there's these two aspects to it. One's a cross-party Team Scotland approach from the political parties, from the Parliament, but also a Team Scotland approach in terms of including Civic Scotland and indeed expertise from Scotland and beyond. I have to confess, I've asked one or two of the experts already, and everybody said absolutely. They would, because, and I can see why. People from areas of expertise would want to do that. It's a really fascinating, interesting, and exciting opportunity. But the Team Scotland, the Civic Scotland, and the expertise, that's part of the team, and that's a great question. Great question.
Chap in the purple, just up there. If you wait for the microphone.
Hello, Mr. Salmond. I'm the incoming student president at the local college, Dundee and Angus College. And earlier you said that education and access to it is in the control of Scotland, and obviously you're right about that. But my understanding is that in Scotland, 140,000 college places have been cut under your governance. And in Dundee College alone, in a single year, our budget lost £4 million and then just as the staff thought the worst was over, it was £2 million again the next year, and so on. And so my question to you is, I mean, we only have to look to the United States to see that tax cuts for the richest people and the biggest corporations doesn't necessarily pay for itself. So my question to you is, beginning your answer with the word yes or no, can you guarantee that in an independent Scotland, not a single other college place will be cut to pay for corporation tax?
No, well, I can guarantee that, yes, because the whole basis of the corporation tax proposal is it increases jobs, productivity and revenue over the medium term. But can I say about college places, and I'm not underrating the difficulties in terms of college budget, but it would be, a more accurate way to look at teaching hours in colleges, because you can't compare in terms of the effort a large number of part-time or one-day courses with an HNC or an HND. I mean, we've tried to concentrate our efforts on full-time courses and courses which lead to employment. Every pound that we spend at the present moment comes as a result, effectively, of the Barnett formula. Not every pound, but 86 pence in every pound. The reductions in real spending, and there have been reductions in real spending in Scotland's colleges, have been about half as much as the college budgets south of the border. Now, the reason that matters, and the reason I say it, is not because I'm saying, oh, well, we're better than what's happening in England. It's because our budget is determined by the English budgets. That's how the Barnett formula works. There's a set budget, and then Scotland gets a percentage of the additions or subtractions from that budget. That's how it works. So anything that we do, as we have done, to cushion the blow on college funding means that other areas of the public sector have to take a higher blow. That's how the finances of Scotland work at the present moment. And what we've tried to do with colleges in order to make it better is we've tried through the regionalisation process to bring about a situation where we didn't have two half-full courses in different colleges within a reasonable distance of each other, but concentrated through the regionalisation on offering courses in one part of the new regional structure. And secondly, to focus and concentrate on full-time places. There's also been an emphasis on higher level education. The second thing I would say is you can't divorce what's happened in the colleges from what's happened to apprentices in Scotland. Of course, many apprentices go to college, but the bulk of apprentices in Scotland don't have a college-based education. And the number of apprentices in Scotland have gone from 16,000 to 26,000 a year, just over 25,000. And that's been a substantial increase. So the answer to your question is college education is a huge priority. Of course it is. It will be a better position when we can allocate a budget based on what we think the priorities of Scotland are, as opposed to having a reflection through the Barnett formula of what's happening south of the border. Can I just say one last thing? There are many budgets in Scotland, many spending budgets that I would have liked to have seen increased over the last few years. But going through a position of the greatest contraction in public spending in my lifetime, and not having any capacity to borrow at all, which is a position that John Swinney has been in, I think over the peace, we've managed to maintain and protect key public services to a degree which our friends south of the border would be extremely envious of. And that's going through an extraordinarily difficult financial period. As we take advantage of the opportunities of independence, then I think we'll be able to judge our public spending priorities on the long-term benefit to the country, not the austerity programme being implanted on us from elsewhere.
Okay. Chap down the front in the suit.
Put the red tie on, so you'd say the chap in the red tie, and you'd even say it. So I'll not be voting in September. I live in England. But I come up here quite a bit because the science base is so strong. So the reason I'm here today is I was up the road, 50 yards up the road, with the Dundee Kinase Consortium, where half a dozen major pharma companies come 3 or 4 times a year for 2 or 3 days because the science is so good. We do shed loads in Edinburgh and Strathclyde in manufacturing. And a big part of that, a big pull, is the co-funding that we get with the UK research councils. And I just wondered, how you're going to deal with the funding agencies to fund the world-leading research. Because at the moment, of course, because through peer review, Scottish researchers get above the UK average, Wales get less. They punch above their weight. How's that going to be maintained?
Okay. Well, the overall figure, but you're quite right, because of the excellence of our research, we are more successful than a population base in terms of research funding. We get, if you take all the research funding at UK level, we get about 10.6% of the whole total. But we contribute 9.4% of the finances of the UK, and that gap between the 9.4 and the 10.6 is about £36 million. Now, we've said two things. One is we see no reason why that research base shouldn't continue as currently administered, and that's actually in our proposal in the white paper. And incidentally, there was some support from that for the Chief Executive of the UK Research Council when he came to the Scottish Parliament committee to give evidence. We think research, as like European research, should be based on the excellence of the research. And we are fully happy to continue with that arrangement. We've also said that if the UK government doesn't wish to do that, then we'll guarantee that gap, that difference in funding, that 36 million, the gap between our contribution share and our distribution share. But I don't think that should be the way forward. The way forward should be to share the common research base. Why not? That seems to be, it's what we do with European research funding. So why shouldn't it be what we continue to do with UK research funding? And I think that would be the preference of people in the field, both researchers and the research councils. They would see that as the best way forward. And we specify it in the white paper. In the white paper, we specify agencies where we think should continue on a UK level, on a UK basis, and that's one of them. And ones where we think it'd be better for her to have our own agency, like the Borders Agency, for example, which we think that would be better administered in Scotland for a whole range of reasons. And that's one of the ones we think should continue on a UK level and be based on research excellence.
But Europe's probably not a good benchmark. I mean, I position research for my company globally. The great thing about Scotland is it's a relatively flat structure. You can get to talk with people you need to talk to drive the science forward. But the other really big thing is that you can co-fund and you can leverage funds. So the research councils would see my company as leverage and vice versa. And I can't see how that's going to work if the vote goes the yes way.
Well, I'm just, as I mentioned, the oral evidence. Professor Paul Boyle, the Chief Executive of the Economic and Social Research Council, while noting it would require negotiations, said, quote, "We strongly support Scotland retaining its position in the single research ecosystem. We would like to see a single research system continue whether there's a yes vote for independence or not," is what he said at the committee. I agree with that. Can I also say that it's not just leveraging from companies. One of the reasons, and it's only one of the reasons, because the other reason is the excellence of our researchers, is that we leverage a lot of research from our institutions, from Scottish Enterprise and from the Funding Council. We're extremely active in doing that because we understand the value of research. There is an alternative argument which is worth considering, and because I'm accenting the positive, we tend not to do this, and that's what's going to happen to the research councils under the plans of the current government. Because while they started off by saying they're going to sustain research, that seems to be under great question now. Whereas we have placed a different value on the importance of higher education, college and university education, both in terms of its economic impact on the individual, but also in terms of its economic impact in the country. We are now a hotbed of life sciences in Scotland, and we have fantastic international projects going on. The World Research on Diabetes, to a great extent, has been led in Scotland, and many other things, many of them happening here. I've been lucky enough to look at in this university. Now, that is based on the forward-looking nature of our institutions, the excellence of the people involved, the attraction that many academics see to working in that environment. But I would submit that our policy as an administration has been extremely supportive of that and extremely supportive of the collaborations which have come about. And I'm very happy to talk further about it because obviously you're one of our important companies that we cooperate with in terms of what our plans are for that.
Okay, time for, I think, one more question. person just up the back there with the, yeah, you with the green, yeah.
Okay, folks, we'll end with a fun question. Alec, you're locked in a room for 1 hour with
God.
Alistair Darling, Prince Charles, and Vladimir Putin. What's the common topic of conversation between the four of you?
Who was the first one?
Alistair Darling, I'm sure you've heard of him. Prince Charles and Vladimir Putin and his interpreter.
If I take spell them one by one like a balloon game, or is it who would do it? Well, obviously, you know, Prince Charles is an estimable guy. You know, I mean, what a fantastic guy Prince Charles is. The topic of conversation, I'm certain, would be to how to conduct interviews. You know, how to conduct interviews without getting your foot stuck down your mouth would be the best topic of conversation.
I mean, on a serious note, do you regret the remark about Putin?
No, I regret the way it was characterised. I mean, I defend the remarks I made and the balance of the remarks I made. I suppose maybe I should have had the wit to realise that Alistair Campbell doing an interview for GQ was probably an occasion where I should have been more careful in my language than I am with you, David. You know, but I didn't like the way that. Well, I mean, as I'm sure Prince Charles and I both know that, and probably Alistair. Actually, Alistair's pretty careful, isn't he? I mean, he doesn't really say much wrong or even much at all, actually. But Prince Charles and I know well that we've got to be careful with comments. I think I was going to say the first time I met Prince Charles properly, you know, we were having this conversation. He'd asked to see me before the first Scottish parliamentary elections, right? And this was 1998. And I thought, this is quite good, actually. This shows we're contenders, you know. And we had this meeting at which the press got a hold of at Burke Hall. But the press thought the meeting was at Balmoral, you see. And so they'd all lined up as close as they could get, at least at the gates of Balmoral, and then they realised it was Burke Hall. And we were in this wee sitting room. And out of the window of the sitting room, as I was speaking to Prince Charles, I saw the television lights arrive, you know. There's sort of dozens of television lights because it was dark. And the press started to gather outside Burke Hall, you see. And Prince Charles and I had been having this conversation about our mutual back problems. We both had very bad backs, you see, at that time. And I was lucky enough to get an operation which effectively cured mine. But he was using a New Zealand chiropractor, you see. And he was telling me about the great ability of this chiropractor in New Zealand who he phoned up all hours of the day and night to get advice on his exercises, you see. And I'm sitting, and Prince Charles is sitting there with his kilt on, you see. And I'm sitting there like this, you know. And I start to sort of laugh, you see. And so he says to me, he says, why are you laughing? Why are you laughing? And I said, well, sir, I'm just thinking, I can see the press, you know, gathering outside, you know, domestic and international. And they're all out there at the gates of Burke Hall, and they must be wondering what we're talking about. And I think the very last thing they think we're talking about is our mutual back problems. So Charles and I would both benefit from being careful who we're speaking to and not being misinterpreted, perhaps.
Okay, well, from the referendum to mutual back pain, that brings us to the end of this evening's session. We're out of time, I'm afraid, and we're now going to have a vote of thanks from the University Principal, Pete Downs.
Well, thanks, David. Now, universities are towing a very neutral line in this particular debate, and there are some very good reasons for that. We've been misquoted in the press recently as to why we adopt that position, but the reasons are, firstly, that it's for the people of Scotland to decide their constitutional future. Secondly, my staff, my students, and all those who participate in one way or another in this university's activities have all got different views on what they would like to see as the outcome of this referendum. And so I cannot speak on behalf of all of them with one opinion. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, out of this notion of neutrality comes the real position of universities, which is to stimulate debate, to create the environment in which the people of Scotland can develop the understanding, the knowledge and the evidence upon which to base their decision on the 18th of September. And it has been a fantastic journey. 8,000 people through these doors to listen to the various pundits, politicians, policymakers, and historians and many others. And now looking around, it's clear that they're not 8,000 different people. Quite a lot of you have been here for many of these events. And I, first of all, should thank all of you and everybody here tonight for participating in this event. Now, there was a lot of questions today for the First Minister. He was asked what he would be doing the day before the referendum, what he would be doing the day after the referendum, what he would be doing if locked in a room with some various dubious characters. But of course, what I'm interested in, and I'm sure what everybody in this room is interested in, is what happens on the 18th of September. And I think we've had some really useful and good discussion to help us form our views. Certainly 3 topics that are dear to my heart came up, and they're about transformation in its various forms. The First Minister talked about the transformational power of childcare, the transformational power of education, including universities, and indeed, and not sort of against the trend in many ways, certainly at a UK level, the transformational potential of immigration, of immigrants. And in the way that's defined in Scottish terms, I'm an immigrant, and I'm a very proud immigrant. I didn't come here for any other reason that I love Scotland. I've grown to love Dundee, and I like to think that we have, in this university, made a very important contribution to Scotland's future. If any of you have been following recent events in the university, by the way, you might realise that some people in the university might wish that I went back across the border pretty soon, but I can tell you I'm not doing that anytime soon. Those are all, I think, 3 really important areas, because not only are they transformational in the effect on people, but they translate into our economic future as a nation in positive ways. Now, returning to my neutral position, those are critical issues, and you make your own mind up about who is best placed and which constitutional outcome will best serve those and the other purposes that we heard about today. And finally, again, on the point of neutrality, in the last 2 weeks, we have had the leaders of the Better Together campaign and the leader of the Scottish Nationalists and our First Minister. And that's a pretty good set of bookends in terms of neutral, informative discussion. And I hope you'll all agree with me that 5 million questions would be nothing without the willingness of people such as the First Minister, Alistair Darling, and many others to contribute to this debate publicly and engaging with us all here. So thank you very much, First Minister. Thank you, David, for tonight.